The peripheral nervous system was designed with pairs of what we call the wires, and of course these wires are going to be aiding in communication between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. Without these wires, the central nervous system cannot communicate with the peripheral nervous system. So now we are going to be looking at these wires and what they do exactly. These wires are what we call the cranial nerves. Good afternoon to you all. My name is TUMNAD, and today we are going to be talking about the cranial nerves. The cranial nerves, they are going to be part of the peripheral nervous system, and they are going to be consisting of 12 pairs of cranial nerves. We previously talked about that we also have what we call the spinal nerves, and of course the spinal nerves are 31 pairs of the spinal nerve. But today we are only focusing on what we call the 12 pairs of the cranial nerve, okay? Now, when you look at this structure here, we have just brought a section whereby we are looking at the brain from the bottom view, okay? We are looking at the brain from the bottom view, just like, for example, if this is the brain, we are looking at it at the bottom view. This is the section we have just brought here, okay? And we are going to be following this kind of order whereby we are going to be talking about the type of the cranial nerve, its number, the origin, where we can find it. We shall talk a little bit of some of the function, or if it have more than one, shall have you the functions, and then we also need to know whether it has the sensory fibers, the motor fibers, or even mixed fibers, which we call both the afferent and then efferent fibers, which is mixed. You may even find some other books saying both, okay? So mixed is same as both. It means that cranial nerve has both sensory and then motor fibers, okay? So now let's go ahead and get started and look at what we call the different cranial nerves, okay? So now we are going to start with the first cranial nerve. You see this bulbar structure here, this one here, you see this bulbar structure just above of this optic chiasma. This one here is our cranial nerve number 1, okay? So now, cranial nerve number 1. Cranial nerve number 1. How do we call cranial nerve number 1? This one is called olfactory nerve, okay? Is what we call olfactory. Is what we call olfactory nerve. Okay? So our cranial nerve number 1 is what we call olfactory nerve. So now, where do we find the olfactory nerve generally? The olfactory nerve is going to be part of the cerebrum, okay? But where exactly are we going to be finding the olfactory nerve? You know, the olfactory nerve have what we call in the nasal cavity, in the roof of the nasal cavity. It's how you're going to be having what we call the olfactory nerve. We even have what we call the olfactory epithelium, which is going to be at the roof of what we call the nasal roof, nasal cavity, okay? And also it's going to be passing through what we call the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, okay? So now our origin, or where we can find the olfactory nerve, we are going to be seeing the nasal cavity roof, okay? The nasal cavity roof. It's such a beautiful thing, okay? So now, what do you think would be the function of what we call the olfactory nerve? And of course, we do smell a lot of different odors just because of this guy we are calling olfactory nerve. So now, in that way, we say that the function of the olfactory nerve is what we call smell. Okay, is what we call smell. But you may find some other technical terms like olfaction. Okay, so if you find some other sources saying about olfaction, it is same as what we call smell. Okay, and then what are kind of the fibers do we find in what we call the olfactory nerve? So now, is it sensory, is it motor, or it is mixed? The fact that it is taking sensation from the nose for the case of odor, this kind of the cranial nerve is going to be a sensory nerve. It's going to be a sensory nerve. Okay. So now that is cranial nerve number 1. That is the most important thing you need to know about the olfactory nerve. Okay. So now what is cranial nerve number 2? Cranial nerve number 2. You see this guy here. See this guy here coming all this point here. See this guy, this is going to be the olfactory nerve. and then it's going to be having a crossover at the optic chiasma before we have what we call the optic tract as it moves back into what we call occipital lobe. So now you're going to be looking at what we call the second cranial nerve. So now what is the second cranial nerve? The second cranial nerve is what we call optic. Okay, is what we call the optic. Now, if I can ask, where do we find the optic nerve? What I want you to know is that the first two cranial nerves are going to be exiting from the cerebrum. Their origin is going to be the cerebrum, and then the rest, they're going to be part of the brain stem. So now we also expect the optic nerve to be part of the cerebrum, but the exact area where you can find this optic nerve, you're going to be finding it at what we call the retina. Okay, it's going to be finding it at the retina. Okay, and of course, this kind of the optic nerve, it is this optic nerve that's going to be helping us in what we call vision. Okay, because when light comes off from the object, it has to pass through what we call the cornea, and then the cornea into the lens. The lens is going to focus it in the retina, whereby on the retina we're going to be having a lot of cells, the photosensitive cells, the rods and the cones, which are going to convert these light rays into electrical signals, and then they move through what we call the optic nerve into the lateral geniculate nucleate before they go into what we call the vision centers, which are located in the occipital lobe. So for that reason, the optic nerve is going to be aiding in what we call vision. Okay, it's going to be aiding what we call vision. You may find some other beautiful terms which other sources are going to be using, which is sight. Okay, so if someone says vision or sight, then that person is doing the same thing. So which kind of fibers do we find in what we call the optic nerve? Is it sensory, motor, or mixed? And this kind of nerve is going to be also sensory nerve. Okay, so that is the little thing you need to know about the optic nerve. Let's look at what we call the cranial nerve number 3. Okay, what is going to be cranial nerve number 3? So now, on this section, where do you think is going to be our cranial nerve number 3? You see, this kind of number 3. Cranial nerve number 3 is going to be part of the brain stem, but primarily is going to be on what we call the midbrain. Okay, so now when you see on this section, this guy here is going to be now our cranial nerve number 3. Okay, this one is going to be now our cranial nerve number 3. So now we are going to be talking about the cranial nerve number 3. So now it is going to be part of the midbrain, which is now also the brain stem. But something which is very unique with this nerve is that this nerve is going to be moving at the level of what we call the superior colliculi, which is responsible for what we call visual reflexes. Okay, if we can extract the lateral side or the lateral view of the brain stem of the midbrain, you will see there are going to be two bulbar structures which are called the colliculi, the superior and then the inferior. So now the superior, at the level of the superior colliculi is where we are going to be having this kind of the cranial nerve exiting, which we call what we call how do we call the third cranial nerve? The third cranial nerve is what we call oculomotor. Okay, is what we call oculomotor. It is the third cranial nerve. Okay, so now what have we just said that's going to be the origin of this nerve? This nerve is going to be originating what we call going to be coming from what we call the midbrain, okay, at the level of what we call the superior colliculi. Okay, it is such a beautiful thing. So now, what is going to be the main function of what we call the oculomotor nerve? Now, this oculomotor nerve is going to be responsible for the following. It has a lot of supply to different types of muscles. But the most important thing which I want you to know is that this oculomotor nerve is going to be supplying some of what we call extraocular muscles of the eye. Okay, so now it is going to be supplying the following. It's going to be supplying what we call the medial rectus. Okay, it's going to be supplying what we call the superior rectus. It's going to be supplying what we call the inferior rectus. It's also going to be supplying what we call the inferior oblique. Okay, So now these are the kind of the extraocular muscles which are going to be supplied by this cranial nerve number 3, and the whole essence of this is going to be eye rotation. Okay, it's going to be eye, or you may even call it eye movement. Okay, it's going to be also what we call eye movement. Okay, so now if you don't want to call it the eye movement, you may even call it eye rotations. Okay, so oculomotor is going to be dealing with what we call eye movement or eye rotation. And if you remember very well, we are going to be having also, actually it's going also be aiding in what we call accommodation. Okay, what we call accommodation, and then also regulating on what we call the pupil size. Okay, if you remember very well, what we call the midbrain, we have what we call the ending for nucleus, which is going to be moving with what we call the cranial nerve number 3 into what we call the ciliary ganglion before it goes to supply the ciliary muscles, which leads into the accommodation processes and what we call the pupil constriction. Okay, so now the primary role of cranial nerve number 3 mainly is going to be what we call the eye movement. So now cranial nerve number 3, is it going to be a sensory, is it going to be motor, or is it going to be mixed? Primarily this cranial nerve number 3 is going to be a motor nerve. The fourth cranial nerve, and where is it going to be coming out from? So now the fourth cranial nerve is going to be more of an exceptional, because for it, it's going to be coming at the level of what we call the inferior colliculi. But something unique with it is that all of the cranial nerves which are going to be coming off from the brainstem are going to be coming anteriorly. But for it, it first goes behind, it exits from the behind of the brainstem and then curves back in front. That is the most unique, important thing to note, is what we call the fourth cranial nerve. And this fourth cranial nerve, you see this cranial nerve here, this one here, and this one here. This one is going to be our cranial nerve number 4. Okay, our cranial nerve number 4. So now our cranial nerve number 4, as we have just said, this cranial nerve is what we call the trochlear. Okay, is what we call the trochlear nerve. Okay, we have just seen the unique features with this nerve that is moving at the level of the inferior colliculi, but it first goes behind and then it comes back in front. Okay, where do you think is going to be the origin of this trochlear nerve? Same thing. Okay, it's going to be coming from what we call the midbrain. Okay, it's going to be coming also from what we call the midbrain. Okay. What do you think is going to be the function of this kind of the cranial nerve? You see, this cranial nerve is going to be serving what we call one of the main extraocular muscle. Okay, going to be serving one of the extraocular muscles, and this extraocular muscle is going to be the superior oblique. Okay, it's going to be supplying what we call the superior oblique. Okay, the superior oblique. And of course, if you are supplying the superior oblique, this superior oblique is going to be helping in the rotation of the eye, like by depressing it down. So in that way, we are going to be seeing that trochlear nerve is also going to be aiding in what we call eye movement. Okay, it's going to be aiding in what we call eye movement. So now, which kind of fibers are we going to be finding? The pathways going to be finding in what we call the trochlear nerve. It is also going to be a motor. It's also going to be a motor nerve. Okay, it's going to be a motor nerve. So that's the little information you need to note about the cranial nerve number 4. So let's have a look at what we call cranial nerve number 5. Cranial nerve number 5. You see this kind of this structure here, this one is going to be now the pons. Okay, so and here is going to be now the pons. So now what does that one mean? It means this kind of the cranial nerve, which you call the cranial nerve number 5. You see this big guy who is having 3 branches, this guy. Okay, this guy here is what we call the cranial nerve number 5. Okay, cranial nerve number 5. And how do we call the cranial nerve number 5? we call him as the trigeminal. Okay, we call him as the trigeminal nerve. This is a super very important. Okay, and the main origin for this cranial nerve is what we call the pons. Okay, we are going to be having this cranial nerve originating from what we call the pons. What is unique with this kind of the cranial nerve is that this cranial nerve is going to be having 3 branches. Okay, this cranial nerve is going to be having 3 branches. It's going to be having what we call the ophthalmic branch, which is the V1. It's going to be having the maxillary branch, which is the V2, and then it's going to be having the mandibular branch, which is the V3. And what is unique is that this kind of the cranial nerve is going to be having a lot of the nuclei. Okay, it's going to be having what we call the mesencephalic nucleus. It's going to be having what we call the spinal trigeminal nucleus. It's also going to be having what we call the principal sensory nucleus, and also it's going to be having what we call the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. And these nuclei are going to be residing in different areas of the brain stem. Okay, in other words, this guy is very big. You see this kind of the vision is going to be now like the ophthalmic, it's going to be the maxillary, and then this one going to be what we call the mandibular branch. And of course, the mandibular branch is going to be moving with the fibers of the motor part of the trigeminal nerve. Okay. Now, what is going to be the functions of what we call the trigeminal nerve? The trigeminal nerve is supplying a lot of body parts. We shall have another video which is going to be focusing on individual cranial nerve in great detail. But for now, I just want you to know that the trigeminal nerve is going to be serving a role in what we call the chewing. Because the chewing, it means that this cranial nerve is going to be supplying the muscles of mastications. Okay, and then also is also going to be helping in picking up sensations. Okay, is also going to be helping us in picking up sensations around the face and then the whole of this area. And these sensations are going to be the pain, they are going to be the touch, are going to be now the pressure, and then also the fourth sensation, which is going to be the temperature. Okay, the temperature. So now this cranial nerve, the fact that it's going to be serving a lot of the areas. So now you're going to be having a lot of the sensations like pain, touch, pressure, and temperature coming from those areas, and then going to be fed into the central nervous system for a corrective response to be made. Okay, it has a lot of the nuclei residing in different parts of the brainstem. We shall come a little bit and come into the detail of this trigeminal nerve, and we see how all those branches are branching off them from the trigeminal ganglion, and they go into the different areas of the body to supply. So now this trigeminal nerve is going to be containing both the sensory fibers and then the motor fibers. For that reason, the trigeminal nerve is going to be a mixed, or what we call both cranial nerve. Okay, it is such a beautiful thing. Okay. Now, that is cranial nerve number 5. Cranial nerve number 6. Now, cranial nerve number 6, you see these green cranial nerves here, these cranial nerves here, these green ones, okay? These ones, which are going to be the medial side of what we call the pons. This one here is what we call our cranial nerve number 6, okay? So now we are moving into what we call cranial nerve number 6, okay? So cranial nerve number 6, we have said, is what we call the abducens. So now the abducens also is going to be part of what we call the pons. Okay, it's also going to be part of the pons as their point of origin. This cranial nerve is super important in the way that it's going to be supplying a specific extraocular muscle, meaning that it's going to be aiding in what we call eye movement. So now it's also going to be aiding in what we call eye movement. Okay, eye movement. So now, which kind of the extraocular muscles is going to be supplied by this cranial nerve number 6? You see, we have this kind of a beautiful formula, which is called RL6 and then SO4. Okay, and then you put in bracket then 3. Okay, so now it means we have the lateral rectus, which is going to be supplied by cranial nerve number 6. We have superior oblique, which is going to be supplied by cranial nerve number 4, and then the rest of the extraocular muscles will be supplied by cranial nerve number 3. It's such a beautiful acronym that can help you remember all of these extraocular muscles and the individual cranial nerves which are going to be supplying them, meaning that out of the 6 extraocular muscles, 4 of them are going to be supplied by oculomotor, then the superior oblique by cranial nerve number 4, and then the lateral rectus be supplied by what we call the cranial nerve number 6. Okay, so now our cranial nerve number 6 is going to be supplying what we call the lateral rectus, leading in what we call eye movement laterally or lateral side. And this kind of the cranial nerve, this cranial nerve number 6 is going to be part of the motor, going to be part of it's going to be a motor nerve. Okay, it's such a beautiful thing. Okay, so let's have a look at cranial nerve number 7. Okay, cranial nerve number 7. What do you think is going to be our cranial nerve number 7? Okay, what's going to be cranial nerve number 7? It is another very important guy. And how do we call this guy cranial nerve number 7? You see this guy, this is going to be the medial part of what we call the pontomedullary sulcus. Okay, pontomedullary sulcus. But medially inside, you're going to be having cranial nerve number 6. Then intermediate before you go to the lateral side to the cranial nerve number 8. In the middle here, just intermediate from what we call the cranial nerve number 6, we have our cranial nerve number 7. And this one is going to be this cranial nerve here. Okay, it's going to be our cranial nerve number 7. And this is going to be now our cranial nerve number 7. Okay, so now what's the name of cranial nerve number 7? This cranial nerve is what we call the facial nerve. And this facial nerve is going also to be part of what we call the pons. Okay, it's going to be part of the pons, and to make more specific, it's going to be part of pontomedullary junction. Okay, so now this cranial nerve is also going to be having multiple of the nuclei in different areas. He is super very important. To mention but if we are going to be talking about some of the functions of this cranial nerve number 7, which is called the facial nerve. And something which I want you to know is that this nerve is going to be helping us in the following functions. The first one is going to be helping in what we call facial expression. Okay, it's going to be helping us in what we call the facial expression, because it's going to be supplying muscles of face expression. That's what's going to be helping us in what we call facial expression. What else? You see, this facial nerve is going to also be supplying what we call the anterior of the tongue. In other words, it's going to be helping us in a sense of taste. Okay, it's also going to be helping in what we call the taste. Okay. And of course, this kind of the facial nerve is also going to be helping us in supplying some what we call the lacrimal glands. And in that way, it's going to be helping us in the process of what we call lacrimation or tear formation. So you may also have what we call lacrimation. Okay? Lacrimation. Okay? It's such a beautiful thing. So now, what do you think is going to be this cranial nerve number 7? Is it going to be a sensory, is it going to be a motor, or is it going to be a mixed? This cranial nerve is going to be a mixed cranial nerve. Okay, it's going to be a mixed, or even you may even call it a both, meaning that it's going to be having both sensory and then motor pathways. Okay, which is the both afferent and then efferent fibers. Okay, that's cranial nerve number 7. So let's have a look at cranial nerve number 8. Okay. So now when we come here to the 8th cranial nerve, you see it is now the lateral side of the pontomedullary sulcus. You see this cranial nerve here, okay? This one here. This one on the lateral side of the pontomedullary junction, we are going to be having our cranial nerve number 8, okay? So now this is going to be now our cranial nerve number 8. Okay, cranial nerve number 8. And how do we call cranial nerve number 8? Cranial nerve number 8 is what we call vestibulocochlear nerve. Okay, it's going to be what we call vestibulocochlear nerve, and this nerve is also going to be originating from what we call the pons. So now, what do you think is going to be the function of this kind of the vestibulocochlear nerve? Another name for vestibulocochlear nerve is what we call the auditory nerve. Okay, and of course, for the case of that, it is going to be aiding in what we call hearing. Okay, it's going to be aiding in what we call hearing, and another one is also going to be helping in what we call balance. Okay, so now the vestibular part is going to be helping in balance, and then the cochlear part is going to be helping us in what we call the hearing process. Now, what is going to be the cranial nerve number 8, the auditory nerve? Is it going to be a sensory, motor, or mixed? But primarily, it is going to be a sensory. It's going to be a sensory nerve, but it has also some very little tiny fibers which are going to be supplying part of the inner part of the cochlea into what we call the organ of Corti, aiding in the movement of what we call the hair cells. Okay, so now it has a very little part of what we call this the motor function. For that, okay, what do you think is going to be cranial nerve number 9? And of course, cranial nerve number 9. Now you see this one here, this cranial nerve here, which is starting from this point here, moving down. This is going to be now our cranial nerve number 9. Okay, it's going to be cranial nerve number 9. And what is cranial nerve number 9? Cranial nerve number 9 is what we call the glossopharyngeal nerve. And this glossopharyngeal nerve is going to be part of what we call the medulla. Okay, you see the whole of this structure here is going to be now the medulla. You see this cranial nerve which is coming here, and also even this side. This one here is the cranial nerve number 9, and it's called the glossopharyngeal nerve, and it's going to be originating from what we call the medulla. Okay, it's going to be originating from what we call the medulla. This glossopharyngeal nerve is a very important nerve in a way that it is going to be supplying a very important muscle, which I want you to know. And this muscle is what we call stylopharyngeus. Okay, going to supply what we call stylopharyngeus muscle. Okay, it is also going to be supplying the parotid gland. What else? It is also going to be supplying the posterior third of the tongue. Okay, it is also going to be supplying the posterior part of the tongue, or the posterior third, or the floor of the tongue of the tongue. So in that way, the function of this cranial nerve number 9, it is also going to be what we call the fact that it's going to be supplying what we call the parotid gland. It's going to be helping in what we call the salivation process. Okay, salivation process, because it's supplying also the posterior third of the tongue. It is also going to be helping in what we call picking up the sense of taste, and also it's going to be picking up a lot of what we call sensations. Okay, a lot of sensations like pain, touch, pressure, and then also some other sensations which are going to be picked up by this cranial nerve number 9. Okay, and this cranial nerve number 9, it is going to be a both. Okay, it's going to be having both sensory and then motor fibers. Okay, it is such a beautiful thing. So we shall later come and extract only the glossopharyngeal nerve, and we dive into it in great detail. Okay, so let's have a look at now cranial nerve number 10. Cranial nerve number 10. You see this guy here. This guy here, this one is moving here, is our cranial nerve number 10. And this guy, cranial nerve number 10, is going to be one of the most longest cranial nerves of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, the longest cranial nerve in the whole body is going to be this guy called the cranial nerve number 10. And how do we call this cranial nerve number 10? He is called the vagus nerve. Okay, he's called the vagus nerve, and of course his origin is going to be also going to be the medulla. It's going to be the medulla oblongata. What do you think is going to be the functions of this kind of vagus nerve? I cannot mention them and finish. This guy does a lot of the functions. Okay, he almost runs everywhere, every body part. Okay, for that reason, he is going to be helping in a lot of functions. For example, he's going to be helping in what we call, he's going to be aiding in what we call GI motility. He's going to be helping in what we call the GI motility. He's also going to be helping in what we call the GI secretions. He's also going to be helping in what we call reducing reducing heart rate. Okay, reducing heart rate. The process of peristalsis. It is also going to be aiding in what we call swallowing process. Swallowing process, or what we call deglutition. And this guy, he goes a very long places to supply and make different physiological changes. This guy, cranial nerve number 10, is super very important. And this cranial nerve is going to be a mixed. Okay, it's going to be a mixed nerve. Having cranial nerve number 10, we shall come later in detail and extract only, and we talk about the vagus nerve in detail, because this guy, he does a lot of function of the body. If you are to forget other cranial nerves, please do not forget this cranial nerve number 10. He does a lot, and that's why he was given the name of vagus. Meaning vagus, he is going to be actually he's going to be now contributing 80 to 90% of what we call the parasympathetic outflow. Okay, it is going to be contributing 80 to 90% of the parasympathetic outflow. Okay, so now all the parasympathetic outflow, they are going to be coming, or they are going to be moving with what we call the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve number 10. So now let's have a look at what we call the cranial nerve number 11. Okay, you see this cranial nerve here is going to be coming here, this cranial nerve. And this cranial nerve is also very unique in the way that this cranial nerve is going to be having a cranial part. Okay, it's going to be having this cranial nerve is what we call the accessory. Is what we call the accessory nerve. But it is going to be having a cranial part. It's going to be having a cranial part, and then also to be having a section of the spinal part. Okay, it's also going to be having what we call a spinal part, preferably from C1 up to C5. Okay, so we're going to be having fibers of the spinal part and then fibers from the cranial sac. And all of them, when they unite, they make one cranial nerve. And this cranial nerve is what we call cranial nerve number 11, which is called the accessory nerve. Okay, so it's going to be our cranial nerve number 11. What's going to be the origin of this cranial nerve? Same thing, medulla oblongata. Okay, it's going to be part of what we call the medulla oblongata. So now, what do you think is going to be the functions of this kind of the cranial nerve? What do you think is going to be played by this cranial nerve called the accessory nerve? You know, this accessory nerve is going to be very important in the way that it's going to be supplying this part, what you call the scapula, and also this kind of this muscle, which you call the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Okay, so now, if it supplies these muscles, what do you think is going to be happening to the rotation of the head? It is going to be helping in the rotation of the head. This kind of movement of the head is going to be under the control of this kind of the cranial nerve, which we call the accessory nerve. So in that way, it's going to be helping in what we call neck flexion. Okay, what we call neck flexion. What else do you think is going to be helping us? It is also going to be helping us in what we call elevation. Elevation of what we call the scapula. Okay, elevation and also retraction of what we call the scapula. When I move the scapula like this, back, front, up, down, that kind of movement is going to be under the cranial nerve number 11, which you call the accessory nerve. And this accessory nerve is going to be a motor nerve. It's such a beautiful thing that's helping us in what we call the neck flexion, and then also this kind of nodding. Okay, so let's look at now the very last cranial nerve number 12. You see this cranial nerve, for it is also somehow a bit unique. You see this area here, this one we're going to be now the pyramids, and then on the peripherals you're going to be having what we call the olive. So now in the junction between the olive and then the pyramid, it is where we are going to be having our cranial nerve number 12 coming from. Okay, you see this cranial nerve here. Okay, in between the olive and then the pyramid, you're going to be having our cranial nerve number 12. Okay, cranial nerve number 12 is going to be what we call hypoglossal. It's going to be what we call the hypoglossal nerve. And this hypoglossal nerve, it is also going to be part of what we call the medulla oblongata. Okay, now this hypoglossal nerve is very important. The areas where it is going to be supplying primarily is going to be the muscles of the tongue. Okay, it is going to be helping in the muscles of the tongue. And for that reason, this kind of the cranial nerve is going to be helping in tongue movement. Okay, it is going to be playing a role in what we call tongue movement. Okay, tongue movements. So with tongue movements, the tongue can move lateral. It can also move up and down. Okay, so now those kind of movement of the tongue, they are going to be under what we call the hypoglossal nerve. What else? You see, this tongue can fold in different shapes. Okay, for example, I can fold it like this. Okay, so I can fold those words like this. So now this kind of tongue shape is also going to be under what we call the hypoglossal nerve. In other words, hypoglossal nerve is also going to be aiding in what we call change of tongue shape. Okay, shape of the tongue, or what we call, I can even call it shaping of the tongue. Okay, shaping of the tongue. Okay, those are the main functions of what we call the cranial nerve number 12, which is going to be the hypoglossal nerve. So the hypoglossal nerve is also going to be a motor nerve. Okay. So now this covers a brief anatomy of how these cranial nerves, where they're going to be located, and then the origin. Let me just have a very quick recap of how these cranial nerves are going to be moving out of the central nervous system. We have said that we have a pair of 12 cranial nerves, cranial nerve number 1 up to cranial nerve number 12. We have said that the first two cranial nerves, the olfactory and optic, they are going to be part of the cerebrum. They are not going to be directly connected to the brain stem. And we have said that the cranial nerve number 3 up to 12, they are going to be part of what we call the brain stem, which is the midbrain, pons, and then the medulla oblongata. Number 4, which is the trochlear nerve, it is going to be coming out from the back of the midbrain, primarily at the level of the inferior colliculi, and then it comes back and front. It is going to be supplying part of the extraocular muscles of the eye. Okay, and we said that cranial nerve number 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve, is going to be also coming from what we call the mid junction of what we call the olive, and then the pyramids of the medulla oblongata. We also said that cranial nerve number 11, it is going to be having a cranial part and then a spinal part. It is also an exception among the cranial nerve. Okay, it's going to be having some fibers from the spinal cord, and then also fibers from the cranial area, all of them making what we call the accessory nerve. It is also one of the unique cranial nerves which are going to be having. Okay, we said that from the midbrain we're going to be having a total of 2 cranial nerves, which is cranial nerve number 3 and cranial nerve number 4. And then from the pons, you're going to be having cranial nerve number 5, cranial nerve number 6, cranial nerve number 7, and cranial nerve number 8. That is from the pons, mainly on the pontomedullary junction. Medially, cranial nerve number 6, intermediate, cranial nerve number 7, and then lateral, cranial nerve number 8. Then we said that we are going to also be having cranial nerve coming from the medulla oblongata. We shall have cranial nerve number 9, cranial nerve number 10, cranial nerve number 11, and cranial nerve number 12. Meaning that from the medulla oblongata, we have 4 cranial nerve coming from the medulla oblongata. Okay, it's such a beautiful thing. Okay, we have covered a lot of things concerning the cranial nerves. Okay, and if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, you really have benefited from it, please make sure you like the video, comment down in the comment section, and you can subscribe at the end of it all. Don't hesitate. If someone else needs this kind of knowledge, please share the video to such kind of a person, because it could be helpful to such kind of a person. Okay, thank you very much. It has been TUMNAD as always. Until we meet next time.